Right, I'm going to start us off. Many of you will know me, but I am Audrey Wilson, the Community Engagement Officer at the Scottish Council on Archives. And welcome to our 8th and our last webinar in the series Developing Your Digital Skills. Today we hear from Sean Rippington, Digital Archivist and Copyright Manager at the University of St Andrews. Many of you will remember him from our first webinar when he introduced the series and the reasons behind why you might want to create a digitised archive and what to consider when doing so. All the presentations from the series are recorded and available on the SCA YouTube channel. Today's webinar is also recorded and will be made available on the Scottish Council on Archives website and the Community Archives Heritage Group website. A link will be posted on Twitter, and now I will give that in the chat room, but it's at @CArchivesScot for those who don't know about it. A couple of notes on housekeeping as usual. So as an attendee, you will see at the bottom of your screen the chat room bar, and you will also see the Q&A bar. Please use these to post your questions. I will be fielding them and I will gather them up at the end, and I'll ask Sean and we can have a bit of a group Q&A discussion about that. For some of you, you might want to use captions. That's when the words come underneath the slides, and that button is in the live transcript. You might see it, it's CC at the bottom of your screen. If you have problems with finding any of this or any other issues, please do pop it on the chat room and I will be here to try and help you out. But apart from that, I just want to welcome Sean back again and let's start. Thanks.
Thank you, Audrey, and yeah, thanks to everyone for coming along, and good to see some of you again, having done the first one in this series. Yep, so as Audrey said, oh, let me get my slides ready. As Audrey said, I'm Sean. I'm going to be talking about digital sustainability for your digitised collection. So we're sort of assuming that, having been to a few of the other events in the series, you are either digitising or hoping to digitise some collections. So what we're going to talk about today is really how you keep that going, how you sustain the work and the collections that you've digitized. Just a quick note, so I've used various images in this presentation. They are all Bright Jürgen Stamp and made available via his website there. And this presentation is licensed for reuse, so you're welcome to use the slides at the end. So I guess the first question here is, what exactly are we talking about? What form might digitized collections take? So I think they will probably take the form of something like a website or a YouTube page, or a media page, Sketchfab items if you've been doing 3D scanning. There might just be some files sitting on your computer, or some CDs, DVDs, USB sticks. Might be some files sitting on an external hard drive. So we're really talking about any collection of digitized material that might be sitting around in some form. There might be photos, videos, like recordings of events or interviews, audio recordings, web pages, social media posts, 3D scans. There might be very large collections, very small. It might be a collection that's run entirely by volunteers. It might have some professional input. It might be something that's been around for a very long time or only just started. It might be partnered in some ways with various other organisations, or it may be completely and deliberately independent. And it may be a collection of digitized material that relates to a physical collection that you also manage. So this is what I think we're talking about today. So what are the threats to your collection, your digitized collection, regardless of the form and the way that you created it? So I think there's a few we need to think about. So there's technical failure. So there's, what if your equipment stops working? What if maybe your hard drive stops working and you lose your files? There's obsolescence, so sometimes particular file formats or bits of hardware or operating systems go out of use over time and become harder and harder to use, or even impossible to use. There's human error, so you or someone else might accidentally delete or alter your digital stuff. That's something you have to be wary of. Natural disaster, your equipment or storage might get damaged in a flood or a fire. There's attack, malicious attack. Someone might deliberately try to wreck your digitized collection. There's, I probably shouldn't have said bad management, but maybe inadequate management. So maybe if your files are just not managed very well, maybe they've got incomprehensible file names, or they're sort of disorganized. You may find that people simply can't use your collection and it just falls out of use. Lack of money. You or your organization might run out of money for things like digital storage, website hosting, in which case your collection will disappear or go out of use. And also just lack of will, lack of support, lack of time. You or your group may find that you just don't have enough time or energy or support to keep your digital archive going. Maybe you were too ambitious and you tried to keep too much and it just didn't work out. So what can we do about those risks that we've identified? So I've got a few ideas that I'm going to go through now. So I think the first one is to choose what you want to preserve. Second one is to kind of get under control, to get hold of it. Third is to keep it safe. The fourth is to manage it. And then the fifth is to make use of it. So firstly, choosing what you want to preserve. So as we've identified, you may have limited, well, you will have limited time, money, and expertise to preserve everything. So you're going to have to make some choices about what's important. You might think about things like, are there multiple versions? Do I need to keep all of them, or just some of them, or only one? Will someone else or a different organization preserve these images or digitized materials for me? Am I happy to let them do that? Does this collection make sense? Does it kind of fit together? Are there things that maybe I could get rid of? Are these digitized materials copies of physical items that I own? Can I keep one or rather than both? Are there legal obligations here? Do I have to keep this stuff? If I crunch the numbers, is this going to be too expensive to keep? Like, are these files requiring a lot of storage space? Is it too late to save this material? Is it already kind of damaged and unreadable? Do I even know what it is? You might say there's not much value in keeping digitized material if you don't really know what the digitized material represents. Am I likely to be able to find out what it is? Is it already published elsewhere? Does it contain personal and sensitive information, in which case there will be data protection implications that may complicate things? Does it contain copyright material, in which case you may find that you're not actually allowed to publish it or put it online, in which case you might think, well, maybe that's not worth keeping. Do I know who owns the copyright? And if you don't, that may make things tricky. Secondly, getting hold of your stuff. So if your digitized collections are stored on disks, USB sticks, hard drives, websites, or social media pages, you'll probably want to get hold of that and make sure that you can make another copy. I mean, we'll talk about that more a bit later. If your collections are stored on social media sites or websites, the administrators of those pages or sites should be able to export copies of the photos and scans. That should be relatively straightforward. You may also want to consider keeping copies of digitized collections as you upload them to websites or social media pages. If you aren't the admin of a social media page that has a digitized collection that you're interested in, it's worth having a look on Google for scraping tools that may assist you in downloading copies of those digitized collections. If your digitized collections are stored on disks, USB sticks, hard drives, or cameras, it's normally pretty easy to make copies. Maybe even just opening up and clicking copy and paste would be enough. If you're transferring large numbers of files from one location to another, or files that are very large in terms of their file size, you might want to take an extra step, which is to use these tools or other tools, but I'm going to suggest two here. One is Exactly and one is Parent Copy, and there are links there. And those will basically provide some assurance and some evidence that when you are copying files from one location to another, that indeed that has been successful and that everything has been copied, which may give you a bit of assurance. Thirdly, keep your digital collection safe. So I think a simple principle to follow is that the more copies you have, the safer you'll be. A good rule of thumb to follow is the 3-2-1 rule. So this suggests that you keep 3 copies of your files, that you store your copies on at least 2 different types of device or technology, and that if possible you try and store 1 copy in a different physical location, so that way if there's a natural disaster, you don't have all your copies stored in one building or one location. So you'd always have maybe a copy stored in the cloud, for example. Yes, so I'll give you an example there. So say you've got a collection of digital photos. You might want to keep a copy on your PC. You might want to keep a copy on a colleague's laptop or your organizational laptop. and maybe another copy in cloud storage, so something like Google Drive or Amazon Cloud Storage. Fourth, you're going to have to manage this collection, so make sure you know what you have. You could keep a list in a spreadsheet. Take a bit of time to organize your archive. Think about things like sensible file names or human readable file names. Maybe managing things in folders, discrete collections of different folders, getting rid of unneeded duplicates, and if possible, maybe keeping in your spreadsheet a description of what you have. The idea here being that if you then have to hand over the collection to someone else at some point, which will probably happen, it'll be easy for them to understand what the collection is and how they can use it. And also make sure that if you have made copies, that you do check them occasionally to make sure that they all still work. Fifth, make use of your collection. So presumably the whole reason you want to preserve or sustain your digitized collection is so that people can use it. You'll also find that letting people use your collection is a good way of finding out if you're doing a good job in digitizing the right things and making them available in the right way. So do encourage people to let you know what they think of your work. Remember, of course, that you may have to restrict access to some items in your collection if they're unsuitable for viewing by the public, for example, if there are copyright sensitivities or data protection sensitivities. If your archive already takes the form of a website or social media page, then you're already making it publicly accessible, so congratulations. If you're not currently doing that, and maybe your collection of digitized material is just sitting on a hard drive at home, you may want to think about how you could share it and let people know about it. You may want to let people know that it exists and how they can contact you to access it. You could make a website, add your collections to an existing website that collects or aggregates content, or add your collections to a social media platform. And I guess there was another talk in this series that probably talked more about outreach and engagement that you could look at. There are some other things to think about. So file formats will probably have come up a bit in this series. So we mentioned technical obsolescence earlier, the idea that sometimes bits of technology go out of use over time. This can be a concern. So try to use commonly used openly documented file formats, things like JPEG and TIFF for images. If you want to know more precisely what you should use or could use for different kinds of content, the Library of Congress over in the States maintains an authoritative list of formats it considers to be likely to be sustainable or usable in the long term, and there's the link there. You may have to think about money. So I think possibly even the biggest threat to the sustainability of a digitized collection is funding, presuming you're going to have to pay for storage and IT equipment and perhaps even a website, staff time and this kind of thing. So you might want to think about having a financial plan, maybe even developing a funding strategy, applying for funding, other forms of fundraising, maybe measuring and recording the value and impact of your archive so that you can make a better argument for getting funding. Developing things like a friends or a supporters group, people who are going to support your digitized collection in the long term. You may also find it useful to partner or collaborate with more financially stable organizations. If you are going to engage in a kind of partnership or collaboration, make sure you think about whether that partnership or that organization shares your values and whether they're appropriate to work with your collection. Whether the collaboration is fair, so is there an equal division of labor or an appropriate division of labor? Maybe even consider having a formal agreement to say who's responsible for what. Make sure you have a clear plan so everyone knows what they're supposed to be doing. Make sure you're clear on who's responsible for what. And make sure that you have a way of leaving the partnership or collaboration in the future should you want to, and that you have some details on how that could work. In some of the guidance I'm going to link to at the end, they talk about professional standards for managing digitized collections. Just a quick note on those. So you may find it useful to use professional standards because they represent best practice in digitization and management of digitized collections. And they do help make your digitized collection usable by others, and they help other people understand what you're doing and how you're doing it. On the other hand, depending on your skills and your resources that are available to you, you may find that using professional standards isn't very helpful because you find them too difficult to use. Maybe you think the standards are actually not very good in some areas, or you just think they're not very suitable for your collection. So when you have a look at the links at the end, just bear that in mind. Copyright, we did talk more about this in the first session in this series, but I'll just mention it again briefly. Bear in mind that copyright law applies to digitized material just as much as it applies to physical material, and it will have some implications for what you can keep and how much you can copy and what you can publish online. So it is worth thinking about that early on to avoid spending time and money preserving digitized material that actually you find you can't use. Likewise, data protection. Again, we talked about this more in the first session of this series, so you could go back and look at that. But if your digital archive contains digitized material containing personal data, so things like names, addresses, and emails, you need to think about data protection laws and, again, the implications for how you store and make accessible your collection. Again, the idea being that you don't want to spend time and money preserving things or digitizing things that you find you can't actually use. Yes, fixity and checksum. So again, if you follow the resources that I link at the end, they will use these terms. The idea here being that your users of your digitized archive want to know that they can trust the files that they're looking at and that they haven't been changed over time, deliberately or accidentally. In the field of digital preservation, that assurance process that a file has remained the same over time is called fixity, and it's a term that you will see in some of the resources I've linked to. Fixity is established by generating what's called a checksum, and you can think of a checksum as a kind of digital fingerprint that's unique to a file. Some of the resources I linked to will talk you through how to generate a checksum and how to make sure that files stay the same over time. That may be not particularly helpful to some of you. It may be too technical or beyond your resources, but just when you come across that, that's what that is, and it may be something you want to consider. So further resources on this, possibly the first stopping point would be the Digital Preservation Coalition, sometimes called the DPC, so I've linked to them there. They have what they call the Digital Preservation Handbook, which is kind of a step-by-step guide to some of the topics we've mentioned. They also do tech watch reports on specific technical issues, which might be worth a look. There's a few other links there that may be of particular interest to this audience. I also mentioned at the bottom that they've started to provide free online training for beginners in partnership with the National Archives in the UK. You can find out more about that at that link, though bear in mind you have to register for that training and places are limited, and I'm not sure if it's available to an international audience. That might be a UK only thing. You'll also want to have a look at the Community Archive and Heritage Group, in particular digital preservation and for community archives, which is linked to there. Community archives and GDPR, film and videotape archives, and help with finding funding will also be useful, I think. And finally, we mentioned earlier the idea that you might want to scrape digitized content or download digitized content from social media pages. Just a few links there to some tools which might be useful for that. There are other tools for other kinds of social media that you could find on Google, but I'm just going to give you a steer on the most common ones there. And that's it. So I realize that was a very brief introduction to a few quite big topics. If you have any questions, you can ask them now and I'll do my best to answer them. I'll also monitor my email account, so if any of you have any questions, I'm happy to try and answer them. Or you can contact me on Twitter there at Sean Rippington. That's the final slide. I'll hand back to Audrey.
I'm coming back now. Yes, I think the course you're talking about from the Digital Preservation Coalition is called Novice to Know-How. I'm not sure if it's open to everyone, but I pretty much think it could be. I've done it, and it's a very, very good course, and I'd highly recommend it for everyone. I think you have about a month to complete it, and you can do it either a little bit every day, or you could sit down and do it in a couple of days. And there's lots of links. It's an incredibly useful course, so I would highly recommend people do that.
And they do now have a new course which is specifically around making collections accessible. which I think just launched
Oh, okay.
recently. So that's also worth a look. I might find the link and put that in the chat.
Okay. I have got a question from Chloe and would like to know, what are the pros and cons of cloud storage?
So I guess the major pro is that, assuming you're using a major tech company, they will have access to easily expandable storage. So you could upload terabytes and terabytes and terabytes at short notice if you wanted to. They will take care of the technical issues. They'll make backups. They'll take care of security. The downsides, the most obvious ones, are you're sort of losing control, so you can't really see what they're doing, so you're just going to have to trust that they are looking after your material for you. The other one worth bearing in mind is things like hidden costs, so make sure you thoroughly understand the costs up front. So some cloud service providers will charge you to get your material back, which not everyone realizes. So if you do need lots of frequent access to your collections, you may not want to use cloud storage for that. Or if you do, you may want to choose an option that has low or no costs for getting your content back. I think those are the main points. I'll try and find a link that summarizes the issues around cloud storage, and I'll see if I can share that as well.
Okay. While you're doing that, Sean, I'm just going to say there's been a comment. I think it's Thomas. It says they're moving away from Google Cloud Storage because you cannot back up from there. This should be used for access and shared files only. So hopefully everyone's been able to see that. I think that's really good advice. I am now looking, sorry, in the chat room. Yes, we're going to try and put that link up for the new DPC course. If I don't manage to do it now, I will put it in the email I will be sending everyone with the recording of today's talk, and I'll also be sending out a feedback form. So don't worry about that. You won't miss out on anything. I'm going now to, I'm just going to go down them actually, and this is from Jill. Roughly how often do you need to check files, etc., to see if you need to migrate to a new format? How do you know when you need to do this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think probably less often than you might think. I think it's, say once it, well, okay, so the Library of Congress link that I provided, where they maintain a list of sort of authoritative guidance around ideal or preferred formats for sustainability. I think they update that every year. So perhaps if you looked at that every year and see if your formats are on that list or if they've dropped off that list, that might be a trigger for thinking about, oh, maybe this format that we used to think was okay is no longer. I would say that I think it's less likely now that commonly used formats will go out of use or become unusable than perhaps it used to be, say, 10, 20 years ago. I think if you stick to widely used formats, you'll probably be fine in most cases. It might be less the case in things like 3D scanning, where that's still an emerging technology, and maybe there's less evidence about what the preferred formats are. But for things like images, we kind of know at this point that TIFFs and JPEGs are widely used, for example. So I wouldn't worry hugely about that. I would probably just check in occasionally, maybe once a year, on that Library of Congress advice.
This is a question, it's from David Longstaff, and it's about starting to catalogue a collection. We've initially thought of using Excel to list the collection, but someone has suggested that Webspace might be more flexible. We've got limited IT skills, so have you any comments on its usability, please? I also, just before maybe Sean answers that, I do want to remind people that there was a presentation that looked at cataloguing, and that you can actually look at that recording. It might be helpful as well with some ideas, but it doesn't maybe mention Webspace actually. So Sean, have you got any thoughts?
I have to admit, I don't know Webspace, so I can't comment on that. Is that basically kind of like a website, publicly facing collections management system? I can talk about Excel. So I think Excel is a really, really good option for starting off, partly because most people will have access to it and you can keep things pretty simple. though it does sometimes mangle dates, so that's worth bearing in mind. It sometimes changes the format of dates. So I would feel comfortable with the idea of starting off in Excel, and then perhaps you could consider over time other options like Webspace or other forms of web hosting for making your collections available online. But I think Excel is likely to be a good starting point.
I had a quick look at Webspace, and it seems to be it's a affordable, highly reliable and scalable hosting. So it's not quite the same as Excel, I don't think. It's a way of saving your collections. Excel is a way of listing them. So I think you'd still need to use Excel if you were going to be using it. Here we have a question. So CAMP21 website is partly a reservoir of items, material and notes about the history of, I'm going to say, Cultibragan Camp, World War II prisoner of wars. At present, parts are not open to the public to view as we are unsure of ownership and copyright. It is work in progress. All web program code is homemade, and when it is complete, we intend to share that to similar organizations. Yes, copyright issue there. Is that a sensible approach, Sean? Just to
yeah, without knowing too much about it, I guess, and like I said, we did provide some guidance on copyright issues, but yeah, I think if you're unsure, then being cautious in the first instance makes sense. I think the thing you mentioned there about sharing what you're doing with other organizations also makes a lot of sense. That's how we get better at things. So
yeah,
learn from others. I would also say if you're creating an online resource, yes, do, as we said in the talk, make sure that you also have like an offline copy of the same content just in case something happens to your website. You might also consider storing a copy of your website in a web archive like the Internet Archive, or maybe even contacting the UK Web Archive to see if they're interested in taking a copy. Again, just on the basis that the more copies there are, the less likely there is that something bad will happen, or that you'll have an unrecoverable situation where you lose your collection.
Yes. Something that's not in the chat room but has come in my email was just a little bit about the idea of collaborating. Have you got any examples of that, Sean, about like successful collaborations?
I can talk about a football club I work with near me, Junior League Football Club over in Scotland, Tayport. So they digitized all their historic matchday programs, like several hundred. They made a website. So we then collaborated with the National Library of Scotland in that we gave them the physical collection. So they are effectively a kind of a project partner in that they're storing the physical collection. The club maintains the website, and we also asked the UK Web Archive to keep a copy of the website. So there's kind of three organizations effectively managing this collection in different forms in different places. And that didn't cost anything. It cost money to create and host the website. But the UK Web Archive made a copy of the website for free, and the National Library took the programs for free because that fit with their collecting area. So I would think of that as a way of a sort of community heritage group partnering up or collaborating with national institutions as a way of taking advantage of their superior resources.
I'm going back to the Q&A actually here. Sean, should website copies of photos always be extremely low res to protect them from pirating? Watermarking is very labor intensive, so suggested alternatives would be welcome. That's an interesting one. What do you think?
Yeah, so I would say watermarking is definitely sort of fallen out of fashion and like probably not worth pursuing. Yeah, the idea of using different resolutions if you are concerned about people exploiting your content is an option that some people take. I don't like it because I like the idea of saying if we're going to digitize this stuff, I'd like to give people the best copy we can. So that's a principle. But if you have commercial concerns, and some people do make lower res versions available online, and then they say on their website, if you want a higher res version, contact us. Perhaps we can sell you a higher res version. So that is an option for people who have to generate revenue.
Yeah, I think something it's interesting is the Glasgow School of Art, when they were designing their website, they thought about their users, and their users wanted images more so than, say, lots of text. So they do provide those images, but you couldn't print out something larger than A4, for instance. So if you did want to have a better quality of image, you would have to contact them. But it also means as well, they're not saying because you're printing it out that you're allowed to use it in a publication. So copyright is slightly different from someone downloading an image. They're two different things to think about. So I think it's thinking about your user group and what do they want from your collection, because that can vary quite a lot. There's a sort of practical question, and I don't know the answer to it, but do you know how long it may take to digitize a collection of around 10,000, I'm talking objects, records, maybe, with a small volunteer staff? I know this may be hard to estimate.
I think the thing to do, I mean, I'm not going to guess, but I think the thing to do there is do a trial of, say, 100, see how long that takes you, and then do the maths and say, okay, if it took us that long to do 100, it might take us this long to do 10,000. I think that would be the approach there.
Yeah, I think that is, and I would also say maybe spend a little bit of time thinking about the training of your volunteers. So make that effort at the beginning, and I think you'll get a quicker and better result as well if you invest at the start. I just want to make a comment because Lorna Elms is coming from Ireland, and she does say that the National Library of Ireland will be web archiving all of the sites in the Irish Community Archive Network. So I think the National Library of Ireland, I think that's probably very much like the National Library of Scotland. I think they are very welcoming and open and helpful to all types of community archives around helping them with collecting and giving them advice about how to look after your archives. So I would definitely contact, if you're in Scotland, the National Library of Scotland is a very good place to go to.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think wherever you are, I would hope that most of your national web archiving institutions would at least help you consider how to go about keeping a copy of your website. So that's
yeah, and also I think in Scotland you've got to think about contacting the National Records of Scotland. Obviously, I think they are incredibly helpful, and they've been involved in doing quite a lot of these webinars as well. So, yes, definitely contact the NRS, as it's called. Now there is just in the Q&A, something has come in from Thomas, and it's just, I think, a comment about how they operate. You can read it, Sean. Do you have any comments on that at all?
Sorry, I'll just open up the QA. So that was Thomas. Okay, so he's saying, yeah, they make the relatively low res thumbnails available online, and then make the higher res versions available for sale. Yeah, I mean, like I say, if you have the fundraising pressure, then that can be a good option. It's just, yeah, getting the balance between creating something that people can actually use and be interested in versus the pressure to make money. I mean, this also happens at national institutions. There are national institutions that do that approach as well. So it's not just community groups.
I just wanted to maybe point out to some people who maybe missed the presentation on cataloguing. It was given by Ruth Brown from Dunkeld. They have got equipment, and they're very happy to let people use it to digitize their collections, if for a small donation, just to cover the costs of, I think, the use, the electricity, etc. So if people are wanting to digitize their collection, they are quite close to Dunkeld, which is in Perthshire, Scotland. I can pass on Ruth's details, and you can maybe come up with some way of digitizing your own collections. So just, I'm going to be taking only a couple more questions. Oh, Ruth is on, and so there she has provided her email and her phone number. Thank you, Ruth, for doing that, because I think that's a wonderful offer for people to have access to that equipment. And it's just asking for the links. Don't worry about links. We will provide all the links that Sean has talked about, and you are going to get a recording of this as well. And if you have a question, Sean has said that he's very happy to be contacted by email after this, and I will provide that in the email that I'm going to send out the recording to all of you.
I was just going to say to Andrea, I think I do have the link there. So it's just right at the bottom of that page. It talks about the next step, which is called providing access to preserved digital content. So
Great.
that's that link.
Super, thank you. So I think that's it. I think, oh, we've got one new message. I might just have a quick look. Yes, and I just want to maybe finish on that actually, because I want to say thank you very much, Sean, as well, for all your input. You've given us 2 presentations, wonderful presentations in this series. They've all been very helpful and very practical advice as well. And I'm going to end it there for everyone. And hopefully we'll do something like this again in the near future. But thanks very much, Sean.
No, you're welcome, and thanks to everyone for coming along.
Thank you. Bye.